A boy's trembling whisper, "I'll never leave you," echoes over the raging Brazos River in 1878 Arizona territory, as 10-year-old Caleb, an orphan scarred by loss, dives into a flood to save a stranger and an infant. His small, brave heart defies the hatred of a war-torn land. What unfolds is a bond that can either heal or destroy, forging a destiny no one could have foreseen. Will Caleb's courage rewrite his future, or will it cost him everything? Share where you're tuning in from, and hit that subscribe button to catch every twist of this unforgettable tale. Can a single act of mercy change the course of history? Stay with us to find out. The Brazos River roared like a wounded beast, its muddy waters clawing at the Arizona Territory's red earth in the spring of 1878. Cottonwoods groaned under the flood's assault, their roots straining against the current that chewed through the banks like a starving wolf. Caleb, a scrawny 10-year-old with eyes too old for his years, stood shivering on the river's edge. His parents' graves, fresh dug from the fever that stole them, lay a mile back at the sagging homestead he now called his own. The wind bit through his threadbare shirt, whipping his sandy hair across a face carved by grief. He'd come to check the riverbank, to see if the flood had spared the meager fence protecting his last 3 chickens. But the water's fury drowned out his thoughts, a relentless thunder that swallowed the world. Then, through the spray and chaos, he saw it. A dark shape tumbling in the current, spinning between jagged rocks and splintered logs. At first, he thought it was debris, another casualty of the river's wrath, but a tiny wail pierced the roar, sharp and desperate, the unmistakable cry of a baby. Caleb's heart lurched, his boots sank into the mud as he squinted, catching the flash of an arm breaking the surface, clutching something small and squirming. No time to think, no time to fear. He kicked off his boots, their soles worn thin as paper, and plunged into the icy torrent. The cold hit like a sledgehammer, stealing his breath, numbing his skinny arms. The current yanked at his legs, greedy to drag him under. But Caleb had swum these waters before the floods turned them savage. He knew their tricks, their eddies, their lies. His eyes locked on the struggling figure. A man, broad-shouldered, his long black hair plastered to bronze skin, one arm wrapped protectively around a bundle that wailed against his chest. Blood streaked from a gash on the man's temple, mixing with the river's churn. Caleb's lungs burned as he fought the current, his small hands clawing at the water. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to save himself, but that cry, that helpless, piercing cry, pulled him forward like a rope. He reached a drifting log, its bark rough against his palms, and clung to it, using it as a shield against the river's rage. With a grunt, he kicked toward the man, dodging a jagged rock that loomed like a tombstone. The man's eyes, dark and flickering with pain, met Caleb's for a fleeting moment. Pride burned there, fierce even as life drained from him. Caleb didn't know his name. Nocona, a Comanche chief, a name whispered in fear by settlers, but he knew the man would die without him. The current slammed them against the log, and Caleb felt his ribs creak, pain flaring like a struck match. The baby's cries grew weaker, muffled against the man's chest. Caleb's arms, thin as willow branches, hooked under the man's shoulders. The weight was crushing, threatening to pull them both under. His legs kicked wildly, fighting the river's pull, aiming for a cluster of cottonwood branches tangled on the bank. His hands, torn by splinters, bled into the water, but he gripped the wood, anchoring them against the flood's hunger. "Hold on," Caleb gasped, his voice lost in the river's roar. The man's head lolled, his breathing shallow, but the baby's cries still cut through, faint but alive. Caleb's feet found slippery river stones, and he hauled with everything he had, his small frame trembling under the strain. Inch by agonizing inch, he dragged them through the shallows, the mud sucking at his legs like quicksand. Finally, they reached the bank, collapsing in a heap of mud and blood. Caleb's chest heaved, his vision swimming as he knelt beside the man. The Comanche's face was pale, blood oozing from the gash, but his chest rose and fell, stubborn as the desert itself. The baby, wrapped in a soaked blanket, wailed softly, her tiny fists clenched. Caleb's hands shook as he pulled his old woolen blanket from his shoulders, draping it over the man and child. His lips moved, barely a whisper, raw with the weight of his own loss. "I'll never leave you." He sat there, shivering in the wind, a boy alone with two strangers who should have been his enemies. The river roared on, indifferent, as Caleb's promise hung in the air, a vow that would bind them through fire and blood in the days to come. The Brazos River's roar faded to a sullen growl as dusk settled over the Arizona territory, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Caleb crouched on the muddy bank, his small frame shivering under the weight of his sodden clothes, the old woolen blanket now draped over the unconscious Comanche chief and his infant daughter. His hands, raw and stinging from the river's jagged gifts, hovered over the man's bloodied temple, unsure but resolute. The baby's soft whimpers, like the cry of a lost calf, tethered him to this moment, a boy alone, bound by a whispered vow to strangers who carried the shadow of enemies. He dragged them, inch by grueling inch, toward the sagging lean-to that served as his shelter, a half-mile from the river. The chief's weight was a mountain, his limp form heavy with muscle and pain, but Caleb's wiry arms burned with a stubborn fire. The baby, cradled against the man's chest, stirred faintly, her tiny breaths a fragile thread in the cooling air. Caleb's boots slipped in the mud, his ribs aching from the river's blows, but he pressed on, driven by a promise he didn't fully understand. The lean-to's warped boards loomed ahead, a frail sanctuary against the vast, unforgiving desert. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and old straw. Caleb eased the chief onto a pallet of burlap sacks, his hands trembling as he checked the man's pulse, faint but steady, like a drumbeat refusing to quit. The baby, wrapped in the soaked blanket, shivered violently. Caleb's heart twisted. He'd seen newborn calves die from cold, their small bodies giving up under the stars. He stripped off his own shirt, tattered and damp, and wrapped it around the infant, tucking her close to his chest to share what little warmth he had. Her cries softened, and Caleb felt a strange calm, as if the act of saving her anchored him to something bigger than his grief. He lit a small fire in the rusted stove, its glow casting long shadows across the chief's face. The man's features were sharp, weathered by years under the sun, his black hair streaked with blood and river silt. Caleb didn't know him as Nocona, a Comanche chief whose name carried both reverence and fear across the territory. To the boy, he was just a man who'd fought the river and lost, a man who needed him. Caleb's eyes darted to the gash on the chief's temple, oozing slowly and darkly. He rummaged through a tin box, his mother's old sewing kit, the only remnant of her care, and pulled out a needle and thread. His hand shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. The needle gleamed in the firelight as Caleb cleaned the wound, with water boiled over the stove. Each stitch was a battle, his small fingers clumsy but determined, guided by half-remembered lessons from his mother tending his father's cuts. The chief stirred, a low groan escaping his lips, but his eyes remained shut, lost in the haze of pain. Caleb whispered, "Stay with me," his voice rough, echoing the vow he'd made by the river. The words felt like a tether, binding him to this unknown child, a lifeline in the emptiness that had haunted him since his parents' graves were dug. The baby's cries grew stronger, demanding attention. Caleb tore strips from a flour sack, fashioning a crude sling to keep her close while he worked. He found a tin of dried goat's milk in the lean-to's corner, a relic from better days, and mixed it with warm water. Feeding her was awkward, his fingers fumbling with a rag dipped in the mixture, but her tiny mouth latched on, hungry and fierce. Caleb's chest tightened, a pang of memory, his mother singing softly to him under a different sky. He pushed it away, focusing on the infant's steady breaths, the chief's shallow ones. As night deepened, the desert's chill crept through the lean-to's cracks. Caleb stoked the fire, his eyes heavy but vigilant. The chief's breathing steadied, and the baby slept, nestled in the crook of his arm. He sat there, a boy carved by loss, guarding 2 lives against the darkness. The river's distant rumble was a reminder of the world's cruelty. But in this fragile shelter, Caleb's promise burned brighter, a quiet oath that would carry them into the unknown, toward a bond that could defy the hatred of a fractured land. The desert night clung to the lean-to like a thief, its cold fingers slipping through the warped boards to steal the fire's meager warmth. Caleb, a boy whittled down to bone and grit, sat vigil by the rusted stove, the Comanche chief's steady breaths and the infant's soft snores weaving a fragile rhythm in the dark. His own exhaustion gnawed at him, but sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with 2 lives tethered to his care, their fates bound by a promise forged in the river's fury. Dawn broke over the Arizona territory, the sky bleeding red across the horizon like a fresh wound. Caleb stirred, his muscles stiff as old leather, and checked the chief's forehead. The fever hadn't come, a small mercy in a land that offered few. The man's eyes fluttered open, dark and sharp as obsidian, taking in the boy with a mix of confusion and wariness. Caleb froze, his hand on the tin cup of water he'd been ready to offer. The chief's gaze held the weight of a warrior who'd seen too much blood, too many betrayals. "You're awake," Caleb said, his voice rough as gravel, steady despite the tremor in his chest. The chief, Nocona, though Caleb didn't know the name yet, shifted, wincing as pain lanced through his stitched temple. His eyes darted to the infant, now cradled in a nest of flour sacks, her tiny chest rising with stubborn life. "My daughter," he rasped, his English halting but clear, carved from years of uneasy trade with settlers. "She lives because of you." Caleb's cheeks flushed, unaccustomed to gratitude. He handed over the water, his calloused fingers brushing the chief's weathered hand, a fleeting connection that felt heavier than it should. Days bled into each other, the lean-to a world apart from the territory's hatreds. Caleb worked with a quiet ferocity, tending Nocona's wounds with boiled rags and a paste of crushed sage from his mother's herb patch. The chief watched, silent but attentive, as the boy mixed more goat's milk for the infant, his clumsy hands learning the rhythm of her hunger. Each cry she gave was a blade to Caleb's heart, stirring memories of his mother's lullabies, but he pushed them down, focusing on the task. The desert sun climbed high, baking the earth outside, while inside, the air grew thick with the scent of sage and the scent of survival. Nocona began to speak, his voice low, like the rumble of distant thunder. He told of Comanche lands lost to soldiers' boots, of nights fleeing across the plains with his people, their fires snuffed out by fear. Caleb listened, his hands busy tearing cloth for bandages, his young mind grappling with a world bigger than his homestead's crumbling fences. In return, he shared his own scars, the fever that took his parents, the silence of a house where laughter used to live. The words came slowly, like pulling thorns from flesh, but they built a bridge between them, fragile as a spider's web, but strong enough to hold. The infant, whom Nocona called Little Star, grew stronger, her cries now fierce with demand. Caleb fashioned a sling from his father's old shirt, carrying her against his chest as he fetched water or stoked the fire. Her warmth grounded him, a reminder that life could still take root in barren places. One evening, as the sky burned orange, Nokona watched Caleb feed Little Star, his eyes softening. "You've got a story worth telling, boy," he said. "One that could change hearts, if they'd listen." Caleb ducked his head, embarrassed but warmed by the words. If this tale moves you, folks, share it. Hit that subscribe button to keep up with where it leads. Stories like these don't come often. Outside, the territory simmered with tension. Settlers' whispers of Comanche raids, hoofbeats of patrols in the distance. Caleb heard them at night, a reminder of the danger lurking beyond the lean-to's walls. Yet within, a strange peace settled. Nokona taught Caleb to spot the signs of fever in Little Star's flushed cheeks, while Caleb showed the chief how to mix the milk just right. Their hands, one small and scarred, the other broad and battle-worn, worked side by side, stitching together trust in a land torn apart by distrust. As the week drew to a close, Nokona's strength returned, his movements less pained, his eyes clearer. Caleb felt the shift, a quiet dread that this sanctuary couldn't last. The chief's gaze lingered on the boy, as if measuring the weight of a debt that could never be repaid. Little Star slept soundly now, her tiny hand curled around Caleb's finger, and in that moment, the boy knew he'd fight to keep them safe, no matter what the desert demanded next. The desert stretched wide and merciless, its red earth cracked like old scars under the Arizona sun. Caleb felt the weight of Little Star in the sling across his chest, her warmth a quiet anchor as he walked beside Nokona. The chief's stride was steady now, his wounds healing, but his eyes carried a shadow, knowing their sanctuary in the lean-to was a fleeting thing, like rain in the desert. They were headed north, toward the Comanche camp, a place Caleb had only heard of in settlers' whispered tales of raids and vengeance. His small hand gripped the sling tighter, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The journey was a grueling trek across sagebrush plains and rocky draws, the wind kicking up dust that stung Caleb's eyes. Nokona moved like a man born to the land, his steps silent despite the pain that lingered in his frame. He carried a staff cut from a fallen mesquite, its gnarled wood a stark contrast to the rifle slung across his back, a weapon Caleb hadn't noticed in the lean-to's dim light. The boy's legs ached, his boots worn thin, but he matched Nokona's pace, driven by the unspoken bond that had grown between them. Little Star slept, her soft breaths a rhythm against the desert's silence. As they crested a low ridge, the Comanche camp came into view, a scattering of hide teepees nestled in a shallow valley, their smoke curling like spirits into the sky. Caleb's stomach knotted. He'd heard the stories, Comanche warriors who struck like lightning, leaving nothing but ash. Now he was walking into their heart, a white boy with no claim to their trust. Nokona paused, his hand resting lightly on Caleb's shoulder. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man who knew the cost of missteps. "They will judge you by your actions, not your blood." The camp stirred as they approached, eyes like hawks tracking their every move. Women paused over cook fires, their hands still on grinding stones. Warriors, lean and scarred, gripped their weapons, their faces carved with suspicion. Caleb felt their stares like knives, each one slicing through the fragile courage he'd built. A tall woman with braids tight as rope stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Little Star, then flicking to Caleb with a mix of curiosity and distrust. Nokona raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the camp. "This boy saved me," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He saved my daughter. He is no enemy." The words hung heavy, met with silence. Caleb's heart hammered, but he stood straight, meeting the woman's eyes. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing Little Star's cheek, then studying Caleb's face. "A white boy," she said, her English sharp, "learned from traitors or captives. Why risk your life for us?" Caleb swallowed, his throat dry as the desert floor. "Didn't have a choice," he said, his voice small but steady. "Couldn't let her drown." The woman's eyes softened, just a fraction, and she nodded, stepping back. Nokona led Caleb to the center of the camp, where a fire pit smoldered, its coals glowing like the eyes of the desert itself. The tribe gathered, their faces a mix of doubt and curiosity. An old man, his skin like weathered leather, spoke in Comanche, his words rapid and sharp. Nokona translated, his voice calm but firm. "He asks why I bring a white child here, when our people bleed for the settlers' greed." Caleb felt the weight of every gaze, but Nokona's presence was a shield. "Because this child is no settler," the chief said. "He honors life." The camp was silent, the air thick with the scent of sage and smoke. Then, a young warrior stepped forward, his face painted with red ochre, a scar running jagged across his cheek. "Prove it," he said, his English rough but clear. He tossed a small knife at Caleb's feet, its blade catching the firelight. "Show us your heart, boy." Caleb's hands shook, but he picked up the knife, its weight unfamiliar. He didn't know what they wanted: blood, a fight, or something else. Nokona's eyes met his, steady and unyielding. "Cut a strand of your hair," the chief said softly. "Offer it to the fire." Caleb's fingers fumbled, but he sliced a lock of his sandy hair, stepping toward the fire. The flames licked at the offering, curling it to ash, and a murmur ran through the crowd. The old man nodded, his eyes glinting with something like approval. Nokona's hand found Caleb's shoulder again, heavier this time, a gesture that felt like a claim. "This boy is under my protection," the chief declared, his voice ringing across the camp. "He saved my blood. He is ours." The words settled like dust after a storm, and Caleb felt the tribe's gaze shift, not to trust, not yet, but to acceptance, hard-won and fragile. As night fell, the camp's fires burned brighter, and Caleb sat by Nokona, Little Star asleep in her sling. The valley held them close, a world apart from the hatred that simmered beyond its ridges. The boy's heart, scarred but stubborn, beat with a new rhythm, one of belonging, however tenuous, to a people he'd been taught to fear. The Comanche camp glowed under a sky ablaze with stars, its fires casting long shadows that danced like ghosts across the Arizona Territory's valley. Caleb sat by Nokona's side, Little Star's weight a steady warmth in her sling, her soft breaths mingling with the crackle of burning mesquite. The tribe's acceptance, hard won the day before, lingered like a fragile truce, but Caleb felt the weight of eyes still watching, weighing his place among a people whose blood he didn't share. The desert night was alive with whispers, of wind, of hooves in the distance, of a world that wouldn't let this sanctuary last. Morning broke with the sun clawing over the horizon, painting the teepees in shades of fire. Nokona stood tall, his wounds now scars, his presence commanding as he called the tribe to the central fire pit. Caleb followed, his small frame dwarfed by warriors whose faces bore the marks of battles he could scarcely imagine. The air was thick with the scent of sage and anticipation. The tribe gathered in a circle, their eyes shifting between their chief and the white boy who dared to stand among them. Nokona's voice rang out, steady as stone, speaking first in Comanche, then in English for Caleb's sake. "This boy," he said, his hand on Caleb's shoulder, "carried my daughter through death's jaws. He is my son now." The words struck like a hammer on iron, sparking murmurs that rippled through the crowd. Caleb's heart pounded, his hands clenched to hide their trembling. An elder woman, her braids streaked with gray, stepped forward, her eyes sharp as flint. She held a woven blanket, its patterns intricate as the desert's secrets, and draped it over Caleb's shoulders. "You are no longer alone," she said, her voice rough but kind, her words carrying the weight of a promise. The blanket was heavy, its fibers coarse against his skin, but it felt like armor, a shield against the loneliness that had haunted him since his parents' graves. Nokona led the tribe in a chant, low and rhythmic, like the pulse of the plains. Caleb didn't understand the words, but their cadence sank into his bones, binding him to this moment. As the chant faded, Nokona gestured to a herd of cattle grazing beyond the camp, 43 head, their coats dusty but strong, a fortune in a land where survival was currency. "These are yours," Nokona said, his eyes locking with Caleb's. "Not just to live, but to belong. You are of us." The boy's breath caught, his mind reeling at the gift. Not just cattle, but a legacy, a place carved out in a world that had left him adrift. The tribe erupted in cheers, a sound that shook the valley, raw and fierce as a storm. Warriors clapped Caleb's back, their hands heavy but not unkind, while women offered him strips of dried meat and murmurs of approval. Little Star stirred, her tiny hand brushing Caleb's cheek, and he felt a warmth spread through him, like the first light after a long night. He was no longer the orphan boy scrabbling in the dirt, but a son of the Comanche, claimed by a chief who saw his courage when no one else had. Yet the horizon held a shadow. Hoofbeats echoed faintly, a patrol of settlers or soldiers, too close for comfort. Nokona's eyes darkened, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. "They will come," he said, his voice low, meant for Caleb alone. "Your people fear mine, and they will not understand what we've built here." Caleb nodded, his young face set like stone. He'd heard the stories. Settlers who shot first, Comanche who struck back, a cycle of blood that stained the territory. But he'd made a vow by the river, and he'd keep it, no matter the cost. As the day wore on, the camp buzzed with life. Caleb learned the rhythm of the tribe, how to mend a teepee's hide, how to read the wind for signs of rain. A young warrior, the one who tossed him the knife, showed him how to sharpen a blade, his scarred hands patient. Caleb's fingers, still clumsy, worked the stone, earning a nod that felt like a victory. Little Star, now thriving, gurgled as women took turns holding her, their laughter a rare music in the desert's harsh song. By dusk, the camp gathered again, the fire pit blazing under a sky turned crimson. Nokona stood, his silhouette towering against the flames, and raised a hand for silence. "This boy," he said, "has given us more than my life, more than my daughters. He has shown that trust can grow where hatred once stood." Caleb felt the tribe's eyes on him, no longer sharp with doubt, but warm with something new, family. The desert stretched beyond, vast and unforgiving. But here, in this valley, Caleb had found a home, forged not by blood, but by a promise kept. Caleb's journey from a lonesome orphan to a son of the Comanche weaves a tale of courage and unexpected bonds that defy the desert's divides. What did this story stir in you? Share your thoughts. Where are you listening from? And how did Caleb's vow resonate? Your reflections keep these stories alive. We're grateful for your time, for letting this tale of grit and heart settle in your bones. Stay with us for more stories that cut through the dust of the Arizona territory, where promises forge new paths. Until next time, keep the fire burning.